The wind, a chill breath from the northern moors, whispered secrets through the thatch of Morwenna's roundhouse. It spoke of rain hardening the Roman roads, of hawks circling hungry over the fells. And of change, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of ice in the eye. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of vervain and wood smoke, a comforting fog against the encroaching autumn. Morwenna, her dark braids interwoven with tiny, polished beads of rowan wood, crushed dried leaves in a stone mortar, her movements economical, her pale grey eyes distant, seeing more than the simple herbs before her. The faint scar above her left eyebrow, a silvery crescent against her weathered skin, throbbed faintly, as it often did when the wind carried such tidings. A memento from the Silchester uprising. They called it, though uprising felt too grand a word for the desperate, doomed scrabble of her people against the iron-shod might of the 9th Legion, 15 winters past. Slaughter was the truer term, one that still echoed in the hollows of her memory. She was a healer, a keeper of the old ways, in Vereda, a village nestled precariously in the shadow of the brooding Pennine hills and, more immediately, beneath the stone gaze of Castra Exploratorum, the Roman fort that squatted a mere 2 miles distant. Its presence was a constant pressure, like a thumb pressed against the throat of the land. Her people, the remnants of a Brigantian sept, trod carefully, their laughter muted. Their old songs sung only in hushed tones when the moon was new and the Roman patrols were sparse. Ira, barely 18 summers and all restless energy, sat by the low fire, ostensibly polishing a collection of sling stones, but her gaze kept darting to the door flap. "The wind carries ill news, does not it, Morwenna?" she asked, her voice a low thrum. "Cater has been gone since dawn." Morwenna did not look up. "The wind carries what it always has, child. It is men who make the news ill or good." But she knew. The unease had been a knot in her belly for days. Cater, her grizzled protector, the cynical survivor of Silchester, his hands scarred from sword work he now disdained, would not stay out without reason. He was her eyes in the Roman-controlled spaces, her ears for the whispers that traveled the traitors' paths. The door flap was pushed aside, and Cater entered, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of damp wool and distant wood smoke. He was a man built like a weathered oak. His face a roadmap of past griefs and enduring vigilance. He shook his head, rain beads flying from his shaggy gray hair. "New eagle at the fort," he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "Legatus Titus Valerius Crispus. They say he is not one for local customs." Morwenna's pestle stilled. Crispus. The name had a brittle sound. She met Cater's gaze, reading the unspoken warning there. This was more than just a change of command. This was the sharp edge of the wind she had felt, and his reputation. "Efficient," Cater said, a sneer briefly twisting his lips. "Pacifier of the Cherusci. He likes his order Roman straight, with no inconvenient Brythonic curves." Ira's hand tightened on a sling stone. "Another boot on our necks, then." Morwenna finally looked at the girl, her pale eyes holding a depth of sorrow Ira was still too young to fully comprehend. "Perhaps, child. Or perhaps another stone against which we must sharpen our wits." She resumed her grinding, the rhythmic scrape a counterpoint to the rising dread in the small roundhouse. The Silchester uprising had taught her the futility of open defiance against legionary steel. But it had also taught her that there were other ways to fight, ways rooted in the land itself, in the quiet strength of their traditions, in the indomitable will to simply endure. To remember. The decrees came within a week, delivered by a stern-faced centurion and a nervous-looking local collaborator who could not meet the eyes of his kinsfolk. A curfew from dusk till dawn. Increased grain levies, the granaries at Castra Exploratorum were apparently half empty. And, most chillingly, a prohibition on unauthorized assemblies of more than 5 persons outside the family dwelling. It was a blade aimed directly at the heart of their communal life. At the secret continuance of their druidic practices, at the passing down of the ancient lore. Crispus, it seemed, was indeed efficient. The final straw was the news from Alicana, a smaller settlement 2 days' walk to the south. They had passively resisted the new grain levy, a silent refusal born of desperation. Their own winter stores already perilously low. Crispus had made an example. No widespread slaughter, not this time. Instead, the village elders were flogged in the marketplace. Their homes systematically looted by auxiliaries, and a dozen young men and women taken for extended labor at a new quarry. The message was clear: compliance or slow strangulation. That night, under a sliver of a moon, Morwenna led a ritual not in defiance, but in grief and remembrance, in a hidden grove of ancient yews that the Romans had, as yet, overlooked. The wind sighed through the branches, carrying the scent of crushed herbs and the low, sorrowful chant of the dozen or so trusted souls who had gathered. Ira's young voice, usually so bright, was thick with unshed tears. Cater stood sentinel at the edge of the grove. A silent, brooding shadow. Morwenna raised her hands, the firelight flickering on her worn face. "They seek to break our spirit," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the sacred space. "They seek to make us forget who we are, from whence we came. They can take our grain, our labor, even our lives. But they cannot take the memories from our hearts, nor silence the songs that live within our souls, unless we allow it." Her gaze fell on Ira, whose eyes burned with a helpless fury. "Open war is their language, child, and in it, they are masters. Our strength lies elsewhere. In the roots of these hills. In the wisdom of the old ones, in the bonds that tie us one to another. We will not break." But as she spoke the words, a cold resolve hardened within her. The passive endurance, the quiet preservation, it was no longer enough. Crispus had thrown down a gauntlet. And Morwenna, keeper of a flame that Rome sought to extinguish, knew she had to pick it up, not with the roar of a war horn as Boudica once had, but with the silent, persistent cunning of the forest fox. The embers of Silchester still glowed within her, and Crispus, with his Roman order, was about to fan them into a new, hidden fire. The first council was held in the deepest part of Cater's dilapidated longhouse, the only light from a sputtering tallow lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the worried faces of the 5 elders. Morwenna had summoned from Verida and 2 neighboring hamlets. Old Beric, his hands gnarled as oak roots, shook his head. "He means to starve us out, Morwenna. Or work us to death. The levies are impossible." Rhiannon, a woman whose eyes held the sharp intelligence of a hawk, nodded. "And the gatherings. He seeks to sever our roots, to make us forget the blessings of Andraste and the wisdom of the groves. If we cannot share the rites, how will the young ones learn?" Morwenna listened, letting them voice their fears, their anger. Cater stood by the doorway, a silent guard, his presence a grim reminder of past failures and present dangers. Ira, allowed to attend as Morwenna's apprentice, vibrated with a barely suppressed impatience, her gaze fixed on Morwenna. "We cannot fight his legions," Morwenna said finally, her voice calm but firm. "We learned that at Silchester, did we not? Our swords are broken, our shields lost. But we are not without weapons." She leaned forward, her pale eyes compelling. "Our greatest weapon now is this land. She knows us. She does not know them. Our other weapon is their arrogance. They believe us beaten, cowed. They see us as simple folk, easily managed with a show of force." She outlined her plan, not a grand rebellion, but 1,000 small cuts. Hiding grain was paramount. Each household would divide its stores, a small portion for Roman eyes, the larger cache hidden in secret places, old badger sets, hollow trees. Beneath the flagstones of a disused byre. Cater, with his knowledge of Roman patrols and routines gleaned from years of bitter observation, would coordinate lookouts. Ira's task, Morwenna explained, was to create a network of messengers among the youth, swift, silent runners who could carry word between villages faster than any Roman courier on the main roads. "They will think it children's games," Morwenna said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Let them." And then, the more active measures. Roman tools would accidentally break. Supplies for the fort would be misdirected or spoiled by the damp. Cartwheels would mysteriously lose their linchpins on rough tracks. Nothing overtly hostile, nothing that could be easily traced back, but enough to frustrate, to slow, to sow irritation. "And the spirit, Morwenna?" Rhiannon asked. "What of the rites?" "We will find new groves, deeper in the hills," Morwenna replied. "Smaller gatherings. We will weave the old words into new songs, teach the children the lore through stories told by the fireside. They cannot forbid what they do not understand." There was a long silence. Old Beric sighed. "It is a dangerous path. More dangerous than you know, perhaps." "All paths under Rome are dangerous, old friend," Morwenna said softly. "This one, at least, we walk with our heads high, even if our voices are low." The plan was agreed. It was a fragile thing, built on trust and shared desperation, but it was a beginning. As the elders dispersed, slipping away like shadows into the pre-dawn gloom, Ira turned to Morwenna, her eyes shining. "This is better than just waiting, Morwenna. This is fighting back." "It is surviving, Ira," Morwenna corrected gently. "And ensuring that what is precious within us also survives. That is the first battle. And the longest." The following week saw a subtle shift in the rhythm of life around Verida. The Romans at Castra Exploratorum noticed it first as a minor irritation. Grain deliveries were slightly smaller than expected, the quality sometimes poorer, blamed on a wet harvest or weevils. Road repairs, vital for moving troops and supplies through the rugged northern terrain, seemed to take longer. Tools vanished, or were found broken in ways that suggested carelessness rather than malice. Small stores of dried fish or preserved meats at outlying signal stations would be found gnawed by rats that had never been a problem before. Legatus Crispus, in his meticulously organized praetorium at the fort, frowned at the reports. He was a man who believed in order, in the predictable efficiency of the Roman system. These were minor disruptions, yes, but they were like grit in a well-oiled machine. He had dismissed the Britons as pacified, if sullen. Perhaps he had underestimated their capacity for petty obstruction. Cater, meanwhile, moved like a ghost between the villages and the fringes of Roman activity. He taught the younger men how to read the signs of Roman patrols, the subtle indentations of hobnailed caligy on a muddy track, the distant scent of Roman cook fires. He showed them how a carefully placed branch, a disturbed pile of stones, could signal danger or safety to those who knew the code. Ira, to Morwenna's surprise and quiet pride, proved adept at her task. She was swift and fearless, her network of young messengers flitting through the forests and across the moors, carrying warnings, coordinating efforts, their movements blending seamlessly with the landscape. They were the unseen nerves of the burgeoning resistance. Morwenna herself focused on the spirit. She tended to the sick, not just with herbs but with words of comfort and quiet encouragement. She gathered small groups in ever-changing hidden locations, a secluded waterfall, a ring of ancient standing stones half swallowed by bracken, the deepest part of the Whispering Yew Grove. There, she would speak of the old gods, of the turning of the seasons, of the resilience of the land itself. She taught them new songs with old meanings, parables that carried the forbidden lore within seemingly innocent tales. Her remedies, too, sometimes carried a double purpose. A poultice for a strained back might also contain an irritant that, if accidentally transferred to a Roman overseer's hand, would cause an uncomfortable, distracting rash. A sleeping draught for a troubled villager might find its way, much diluted, into a Roman sentry's water skin, courtesy of a clumsy Briton menial at the fort. One day, a frantic Ira burst into Morwenna's roundhouse. "They have taken Gethin," she gasped, her chest heaving. Gethin was a quiet man from a neighboring hamlet. A woodcarver whose skill with ancient symbols was renowned. The Romans. They said his carvings were seditious. "They beat him, Morwenna, they are taking him to the fort." Morwenna felt a cold dread grip her. This was Crispus, tightening the net. Gethin knew many of the old ways. Under duress, he might reveal things. Cater. He saw it. He sent word. Gethin is alone, with only 2 auxiliaries guarding him. They are taking the old forest track, the one by Raven's Crag. Morwenna's mind raced. Raven's Crag was treacherous, a narrow path with a steep drop. An ambush was too risky, too overt. But perhaps. "Ira," she said, her voice calm despite the turmoil within. "Gather your swiftest runners. Tell them to create a diversion, a fire, perhaps, a small, controlled blaze in the dry bracken on the far side of the crag. Something to draw the auxiliaries' attention, to make them careless. Cater will meet me at the standing stones near the track. We have little time." She grabbed her satchel of herbs. This was a gamble. A direct intervention. But Gethin could not be allowed to reach the fort. The cost would be too high. The hidden flame was about to burn a little brighter, and with it, the risk of being consumed. The air near Raven's Crag was sharp with the resinous scent of pine and damp earth. Morwenna and Cater crouched behind a tumble of moss-covered boulders, overlooking the narrow track that snaked along the cliff edge. Below, the river roared, a grey ribbon in the gorge. Cater, his face grim, tested the edge of his seeks. A long knife he rarely carried these days. 2 Thracians, he muttered, his eyes scanning the path. They will be jumpy. Not used to these hills. Morwenna nodded, her own senses straining. She could hear the distant, faint shouts, Ira's diversion, she hoped. A thin plume of smoke was beginning to rise from beyond the crag, carried on the shifting wind. "They will be distracted," she whispered. "But we must be swift. Our aim is not to kill, Cater. Only to free Gethin and make it look like an escape, or at worst, an accident." Cater grunted. Easier said. "What is the plan, then, Druidess? Sing them to sleep." Morwenna ignored his barb. "When they round the bend, where the path narrows, you will dislodge the scree from above. Just enough to startle them, to separate them from Gethin. I will have my part ready." She indicated a small clay pot in her satchel, filled with a pungent mixture of powdered hellebore and stinging nettle seeds. They did not have to wait long. The 2 Thracian auxiliaries came into view, their movements betraying their unease in the wild terrain. Between them stumbled Gethin, his face bruised, his hands bound. As they reached the narrowest point of the path, one of the Thracians glanced nervously towards the plume of smoke. Now thicker and darker. He muttered something to his companion. "Now, Cater," Morwenna hissed. With a grunt, Cater levered a large, precariously balanced rock with a sturdy branch. It tumbled, followed by a cascade of smaller stones and loose earth, right onto the path ahead of the auxiliaries. They yelled in alarm, jumping back. One lost his footing momentarily, his spear clattering on the rocks. Gethin, seeing his chance, stumbled sideways. In that instant of confusion, Morwenna darted from their hiding place. She did not run towards Gethin, but towards the auxiliaries. With a swift, practiced movement, she flung the contents of her clay pot directly into their faces. The effect was instantaneous. The Thracians roared in pain and surprise, clawing at their eyes, the fine powder causing intense irritation and temporary blindness. One staggered dangerously close to the cliff edge. Gethin, meanwhile, had scrambled further away, towards Cater, who was now moving to cut his bonds. Quickly, Morwenna urged, her heart pounding. She grabbed Gethin's arm, pulling him towards the dense undergrowth. Cater, having freed Gethin's hands, covered their retreat, his seeks glinting menacingly at the still flailing auxiliaries. They vanished into the forest just as Ira and two other young runners appeared. From the direction of the now dying fire, their faces flushed with excitement and exertion. "Did it work?" Ira whispered. "For now," Morwenna said, leading the shaken Gethin deeper into the woods. "But Crispus will not let this rest. He will know this was no mere accident." The taste of their small victory was already tainted with the foreboding of what was to come. She had revealed a glimpse of her hand. And the Roman eagle had sharp eyes. Legatus Titus Valerius Crispus studied the report from the Thracian patrol with a cold, analytical gaze. His praetorium at Castra Exploratorum was a model of Roman order, scrolls neatly stacked, writing implements precisely arranged, maps of the surrounding territory pinned to a large wooden board. The scent of oiled leather and papyrus was a familiar comfort. This report, however, was an irritant. Two experienced auxiliaries, bested by a sudden rockfall and some kind of stinging dust. A prisoner, a known carver of potentially seditious symbols, escaped. A conveniently timed fire nearby. It was too neat, too coordinated for mere happenstance. The woman, Morwenna, his optio, Decimus, had said. The local healer. She has influence. The men say she knows the hills like the back of her hand. And she was present at the Silchester business. Years ago. A survivor. Crispus tapped a stylus against the map, his eyes narrowed on the cluster of villages around Verida. Influence, he mused, a dangerous commodity in untrained hands. He had dealt with such figures before, in Germania, in Pannonia. The quiet ones were often the most troublesome, the ones who wove dissent into the very fabric of daily life, who kept alive the embers of old grievances. They were harder to root out than a hot-headed chieftain eager for a fight. He had initially dismissed this Morwenna as a rustic herbalist, a harmless anachronism. But the Gethin incident, coupled with the subtle but persistent disruptions to Roman efficiency in the region, pointed to a more organized intelligence. A hidden flame, indeed. And it needed to be extinguished before it spread. Decimus, Crispus said, his voice devoid of emotion. Increase the surveillance on Verida. Discreetly. I want to know who visits this Morwenna, where she goes, what herb she gathers that might be more than mere remedies. And find me a local, someone with a grievance, or a weakness for coin. Someone who can get closer to her than our patrols can. He would not make the mistake of underestimation again. This was not a military campaign in the traditional sense. It was a battle for control, for order. And Titus Valerius Crispus prided himself on his ability to impose Roman order, by whatever means necessary. He looked at the map again, a predatory stillness in his gaze. Morwenna and her hidden network were now marked. The pressure mounted in the weeks that followed. Roman patrols became more frequent, their routes less predictable. Strangers, ostensibly traders or itinerant craftsmen, appeared in the villages, their eyes too keen, their questions too casual. Morwenna knew Crispus was closing in. Her small acts of sabotage had to become even more circumspect, her secret gatherings smaller, held in even more remote locations. The air itself felt tight with suspicion. Ira chafed under the increased caution. "We are doing nothing," she complained one evening, as they sorted dried herbs by the dim light of a rush lamp. "Gethin is safe." "Yes, but Crispus still rules. His men still take our food, still eye our women. We need to strike back harder." "And how would you have us strike, Ira?" Morwenna asked, her voice weary. "With sling stones against their shields, with sharpened sticks against their gladii. We are not Boudica. Child. We do not have an army at our backs." The memory of Boudica's fiery rebellion, ultimately crushed by Roman discipline, was a stark reminder of the odds. Their fight had to be different. "But we could do more," Ira insisted. "Cater says the granary at the fort is poorly guarded on the western side, near the old earthworks. A well-aimed fire arrow. And bring the entire cohort down on Verita," Morwenna interrupted, her voice sharp. "You think Crispus would not know who was responsible, you think he would not make every man, woman, and child in this valley pay for such an act," she sighed, her anger deflating. "Patience, Ira. Courage is not always about the loudest roar. Sometimes, it is about the quietest endurance, the most careful step." But even Morwenna felt the strain. The constant vigilance was exhausting. One rainy afternoon, Cater returned from a scouting trip, his face grimmer than usual. "There is a new collaborator in Dunham," he said, naming a nearby hamlet. "A man named Malorix. His crops failed last season. They say Crispus offered him silver for information." Morwenna's heart sank. A collaborator was a cancer in their midst. "Does he know anything of us?" "Not yet, I think. But he is asking questions. About who still speaks of the old gods, who is unhappy with the levies." Cater spat into the fire. "He was always a weasel, that one. This changed things. Crispus was no longer just using Roman intelligence, he was turning their own people against them. The need for a bolder stroke, something to disrupt Crispus's network and restore morale, gnawed at Morwenna. But what? The opportunity, when it came, was wrapped in danger. A Roman courier, carrying dispatches from Crispus to the larger legionary base at Eboracum, was reported to be taking a little-used northern route, supposedly to avoid recent minor landslides on the main road. He would be lightly escorted. If those dispatches could be intercepted, they might reveal Crispus's plans, his informants, the extent of his knowledge about their activities. It was a huge risk. Intercepting an official Roman courier was a capital offense, inviting brutal retribution. Morwenna discussed it with Cater and Ira in the dead of night, in the heart of the yew grove. Cater was against it. Too dangerous. "The dispatches will be coded. And even if we get them, what then? We cannot read their Latin script fluently enough to decipher military codes quickly." Ira, predictably, was eager. "But if we could, Morwenna, think what we might learn, we could warn others. We could strike before Crispus does." Morwenna weighed the risks. Cater was right. It was incredibly dangerous. But Ira also had a point. Knowledge was power, and they were operating in near blindness. If they could gain an advantage, however slight. "There is a man," Morwenna said slowly, thinking of an old contact, a disillusioned Briton scholar named Aelin who had once served as a scribe for a minor Roman official before retreating to a secluded valley. He reads Latin. He despises Rome for what they did to his family during Agricola's campaigns. If we could get the dispatches to him. The plan began to form, desperate and fraught with peril. It would involve an ambush, not to kill, but to incapacitate and seize the message pouch. It would require perfect timing. Perfect execution. And it would bring them into direct, violent confrontation with Roman soldiers. The hidden flame was flickering dangerously close to becoming an open blaze. Morwenna knew, with a chilling certainty, that this operation, succeed or fail, would change everything. Crispus's hunt would become relentless. The chosen spot for the ambush was a narrow, wooded defile where the ancient track crossed a shallow stream. Thick hazel and alder grew close to the path, offering excellent cover. Kader, his old warrior instincts reawakened, had chosen it well. He, Morwenna, and Ira, along with two of Verida's hardiest young men, Brennus and Donal, lay hidden, their hearts thudding in unison with the nervous chirping of a hidden wren. Morwenna had prepared small leather bags filled with a fine powder of dried wolfsbane and sneeze-wort, not lethal in small airborne doses, but enough to cause violent sneezing, watering eyes, and disorientation. "Remember," Morwenna whispered, her voice barely audible above the gurgle of the stream, "the courier's pouch is the prize. We avoid killing if possible. We are shadows, not butchers." Brennus and Donal, armed with heavy staves, nodded, their young faces pale but set. Ira clutched a short, sharp hunting knife, her knuckles white. Kader, his seeks loosened in its sheath, merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the path. They heard the Romans before they saw them, the clink of harness, the rhythmic tread of Caligae, a snatch of a rough Latin song. Then they appeared, the courier, a young, nervous-looking soldier, flanked by two burly Batavian auxiliaries, their expressions bored but alert. As they reached the stream, Kader gave a low whistle, the signal. Brennus and Donal burst from the undergrowth with wild yells, not attacking directly but feinting towards the horses' heads, trying to spook them. The Batavians reacted instantly, their short swords hissing from their scabbards. The courier reined in his horse, his eyes wide with alarm. In that moment of distraction, Morwenna and Ira darted towards him from the opposite side. Morwenna flung her bag of powder towards the courier's face. He coughed, recoiling, but managed to stay mounted. Ira, agile as a wildcat, leaped for the message pouch slung across his chest. She slashed at the strap with her knife. One of the Batavians, seeing the real threat, bellowed and charged towards Ira. Kader met him, his seeks a blur of motion, deflecting the Batavian's sword in a shower of sparks. The other Batavian was now contending with Brennus and Donal, who used their staves with surprising effectiveness to keep him off balance. The courier, still coughing and half-blinded, fumbled for his own weapon. Ira, her knife having severed the strap, snatched the leather pouch. "Got it," she cried, turning to flee. But the courier, enraged, grabbed her arm, pulling her from her feet. She fell heavily, the pouch skittering across the muddy ground. The Batavian fighting Kader disengaged with a savage backhand. That sent Kader stumbling, then lunged for Ira. Morwenna screamed, a raw, primal sound. She threw herself at the Batavian, clawing at his face, trying to give Ira time. The man roared, swatting her away like an insect. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. Through a haze of pain, she saw the Batavian raise his sword. Over Ira. Then Kader was there again, roaring like a wounded bear, his seeks plunging deep into the Batavian's side, just beneath the armpit. The soldier gasped, his sword falling from nerveless fingers, and crumpled to the ground. The other Batavian, seeing his comrade fall and Brennus and Donal pressing him hard, decided the odds had shifted. With a curse, he turned and fled back down the path, abandoning the courier. The courier himself, terrified, spurred his horse and galloped after him, leaving the precious dispatches lying in the mud. Ira, shaken but unharmed, retrieved the pouch. Brennus and Donal were panting, their staves dented. Kader leaned against a tree, clutching his side where the Batavian's backhand had struck him. Blood seeped between his fingers. Kader, Morwenna rushed to him, her earlier pain forgotten. The wound was ugly, a deep gash. "Just a scratch, Druidess," he grunted, but his face was pale. They had the dispatches. But the cost was already mounting. 2 Roman soldiers, 1 dead, 1 wounded, would not go unanswered. Crispus's net would now be a cage of iron. Aelin the scribe lived in a secluded quarry, a day's hard walk into the wildest part of the hills. He was a recluse, a man whose quiet life was devoted to the few precious scrolls he had managed to salvage from his past life. And to the bitter memory of his family, lost to Roman pacification. When Morwenna, Ira, and a heavily bandaged Cater arrived at his turf-roofed hut, he greeted them with suspicion that slowly yielded to a grudging willingness when Morwenna explained their purpose and showed him the Roman message pouch. For 2 days, Aelin pored over the wax tablets and scraps of papyrus within the pouch, his brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally muttering Latin phrases that Morwenna only partially understood. The dispatches were indeed coded, but Aelin, with his knowledge of Roman administrative shorthand and military ciphers from his time as a scribe, began to unravel them. The news was grim. Crispus was planning a major sweep of the northern territories, ostensibly to conduct a census and identify suitable candidates for military service, but the underlying purpose, Aelin deciphered, was to map out all settlements, identify potential ringleaders of dissent, and establish a tighter network of informants and control points. There were lists of names, individuals already under suspicion. Gethin's name was there, and chillingly, so was Morwenna's, marked with a query. Healer, Druidess, source of local influence, investigate further. There was also mention of a new fort planned for the valley where Verita lay, a permanent stone presence that would choke the life from their community. And there was Malorix, the collaborator. His reports to Crispus were detailed, naming names of those who had grumbled about the levies, who had been seen near ancient, supposedly abandoned shrines. He was proving to be a valuable asset to the Romans. "He means to dissect us, piece by piece," Morwenna said, her voice heavy, when Aelin had finished his translation. "This census. It is a pretext to identify and remove anyone who might resist." Cater, his wound throbbing, cursed softly. "A new fort in our valley. That will be the end of us." Ira looked at Morwenna, her youthful eagerness now tempered with a new sobriety. "What do we do, Morwenna? We cannot fight a new fort. We cannot hide from a census that will count every soul." Morwenna felt a cold despair try to take root. Crispus was methodical, relentless. But then she looked at Aelin, his face etched with the pain of old losses but also with a spark of defiance as he translated the Romans' plans. She looked at Cater, wounded but resolute. At Ira, her fear warring with her courage, and she knew despair was a luxury she could not afford. "We cannot stop the census entirely," she said. "But we can disrupt it. We can ensure that the names Crispus seeks are not the ones he finds. We can make his informants unreliable. And Malorix." A hard glint came into her eyes. "Malorix must be silenced. Not by death, perhaps. But his words must lose their poison. Their next moves would have to be even more carefully orchestrated. They had gained vital intelligence, but they were now undeniably marked. Crispus would be hunting them with the full resources of his command. The hidden flame would need to burn with a fierce, controlled intelligence to avoid being snuffed out. The plan to discredit Malorix was risky, relying on Roman arrogance and the collaborators' own greed. Morwenna knew that Malorix, despite his newfound silver, still owed debts to less scrupulous traders who frequented the Roman settlements. Cater, using his network of informants, discovered that Malorix was due to receive a significant payment from Crispus for his latest list of suspects. This payment was to be delivered discreetly by a low-ranking Roman clerk. Morwenna's plan was to intercept that payment, not to keep it, but to make it appear as though Malarix himself had staged a robbery to defraud both the Romans and his creditors, while also planting evidence suggesting he was a double agent, selling useless information to Crispus while secretly aiding the rebels. Ira, disguised as a ragged goatherd, was tasked with observing Malarix's movements and the clerk's arrival. Brennus and Donal, under Cater's direction, would create a diversion at the opposite end of Dunham Hamlet when the exchange was due to happen, a sudden, chaotic but harmless stampede of a few loosely penned Roman supply mules. In the ensuing confusion, Cater, his face masked, would accost the Roman clerk, not harming him but terrifying him enough to drop the coin pouch. Morwenna, also disguised, would then approach Malarix, pretending to be a messenger from a powerful rebel leader, offering him more silver than the Romans paid, in exchange for him feeding Crispus misleading information. She would ensure this meeting was partially, and seemingly accidentally, observed by someone known to be loyal to Rome but too timid to intervene directly, someone who would later report it to Crispus. The dropped Roman coin pouch would then be found near Malarix's dwelling, along with a few crudely carved Brythonic charms of a type known to be used by rebel sympathizers. It was a complex web of deception. It relied on precise timing and the predictable reactions of those involved. The day of the operation was tense. The mule stampede went off as planned, creating the desired chaos. Cater, moving with surprising speed for a wounded man, secured the Roman coin pouch from the terrified clerk. Morwenna's meeting with a bewildered and then increasingly greedy Malarix was subtly observed by the Roman loyalist, exactly as intended. The evidence was planted. Within 2 days, Crispus received a garbled report from his clerk about being robbed by a masked ruffian, and a more detailed, hushed account from the loyalist villager about Malarix meeting a mysterious, cloaked figure and accepting a pouch of coins. When the original Roman payment was then discovered near Malarix's home alongside the rebel charms, Crispus's suspicions about Malarix's reliability ignited. Malarix, summoned to the fort, protested his innocence vehemently, but the circumstantial evidence, coupled with the fact that his recent intelligence had led to several fruitless Roman searches, sealed his fate in Crispus's eyes. He was not executed. Crispus was too pragmatic for that. Instead, Malarix was stripped of his Roman patronage, his new silver confiscated, and he was left to the mercy of his angry creditors and a community that now viewed him with contempt and suspicion. His days as a useful informant were over. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It sowed confusion within Crispus's intelligence network and sent a clear message to other potential collaborators. But Morwenna knew it had also raised the stakes. Crispus was no fool. He would realize he was dealing with a more sophisticated opponent than he had initially thought. His hunt would become even more personal, more determined. The planned census, however, was still looming. And the threat of the new fort in Verita Valley remained. Morwenna's mind raced, seeking a way to turn Crispus's own plans against him. To use his methodical Roman order to create their own kind of chaos. The ancient land of Britannia, with its mists and hidden places, had always been an ally to its children. Now, more than ever, Morwenna would need to call upon its deepest secrets. The census was Crispus's grand design, a meticulous accounting of every soul, every head of livestock, every measure of land under his jurisdiction. It was, Morwenna knew, a weapon disguised as administration. The lists of names it generated would become lists of targets, of potential conscripts, of families to be displaced when the new fort, Castra Firma, as Crispus had already named it in his dispatches, was built in their valley. Morwenna's counterplan was born of desperation and an intimate understanding of her people and the land. They could not refuse the census, but they could corrupt it. Villages would misremember names. Families would suddenly have fewer able-bodied young men and more ailing elders than Roman records might expect. Children would wander off on counting day. Records of grain stores, already depleted by their earlier efforts, would be further obfuscated by accidental spills and vermin infestations that always seemed to occur just before a Roman official arrived. It was a campaign of frustrating, petty inaccuracies, designed to make the Roman ledgers a morass of unreliable data. Ira and her network of young messengers became vital, carrying warnings of approaching census takers, coordinating the disappearance of people and resources, and spreading carefully crafted rumors about impassable tracts or localized outbreaks of more fever in areas the Romans intended to survey. Cater, meanwhile, focused on the surveyors Crispus sent to map the valley for Castra Firma. These were engineers and pioneers, not hardened legionaries. Using his knowledge of the terrain, Cater and a few trusted men subtly altered landmarks, moved boundary stones, and created diversions that led the surveyors on wild goose chases through bogs and dense thickets. Survey markers would vanish overnight, or be found inexplicably moved miles from their original positions. The Romans, unfamiliar with the shifting mists and treacherous footing of the northern fells, grew increasingly frustrated. Their precise maps began to look like a drunkard's scrawl. Crispus, however, was not so easily deterred. He saw the pattern of obstruction. He knew Morwenna was behind it, her influence a constant thorn in his side. He decided it was time to draw her out, to force a confrontation. He announced a grand festival of Roman-Briton friendship to be held at Castra Exploratorum. Attendance by village elders from the surrounding region was declared mandatory. There would be distributions of Roman grain, a paltry offering, Morwenna knew, taken from their own levies, displays of Roman military prowess, and speeches about the benefits of Roman rule. It was, Morwenna recognized instantly, a trap. A perfect opportunity for Crispus to identify and arrest key figures of the resistance, including herself, in a controlled environment. Away from their supportive communities, the dispatches Alan had translated had warned of such a tactic. "We cannot go," Cater stated flatly when the decree arrived. "It is a snare. If we do not go, he will send his legionaries to fetch us," Ira argued, her face pale. "He will use it as a pretext to ravage the villages." Morwenna felt the weight of an impossible choice. To go was to walk into the lion's den. To refuse was to invite retribution upon her people. Her mind raced, searching for a third way, a path through the thorns. The festival was 3 days hence. Time was desperately short. "Crispus expects us to be predictable," Morwenna said, a new light dawning in her pale eyes. "He expects either compliance or outright defiance. We will give him neither. We will give him chaos. The kind of chaos that even a Roman legatus cannot control." Her plan was audacious, relying on precise timing, a deep understanding of Roman psychology, and more than a little luck. It was not about attacking the fort. It was about turning Crispus's meticulously planned festival into a monumental embarrassment, one that would make him look incompetent to his superiors and, more importantly, provide cover for their own objectives. The objective was twofold: to avoid capture, and to publicly humiliate Malarix's replacement as Crispus's key informant, a sycophantic village elder from a distant settlement named Vortiper, who had been overly eager to curry favor with the Romans. Vortiper was due to give a speech praising Roman generosity at the festival. Morwenna intended for his speech to be memorable, but not in the way he or Crispus intended. She set her network in motion. Ira and her swiftest runners carried coded messages. Cater, Brennus, and Donal were tasked with procuring certain items. Alan, the reclusive scribe, was consulted for his knowledge of Roman hierarchies and what might cause the most administrative disruption. The morning of the festival dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with unspoken tension. Delegations of elders, their faces grim, began the reluctant trek towards Castra Exploratorum. Morwenna, Ira, and Cater were among them, their expressions carefully neutral, their minds racing with the intricate details of their plan. Morwenna carried her usual healer's satchel, but today it contained more than just soothing balms. As they approached the fort, the sounds of forced merriment, Roman military music, the loud calls of vendors selling watered-down wine, reached them. Crispus himself stood at the main gate. His presence imposing, his eyes scanning each arriving group. Morwenna met his gaze briefly, offering a slight, submissive inclination of her head, a gesture that cost her deeply but was necessary for the illusion. The festival was a carefully staged affair within the fort's parade ground. Roman soldiers, feigning camaraderie, mingled with the nervous Britons. The promised grain distribution was indeed paltry. Then came the speeches. Crispus spoke first, his Latin crisp and condescending, full of platitudes about Roman justice and the Pax Romana. Then it was Vortiper's turn. He stepped onto the small wooden platform, beaming obsequiously, his prepared speech clutched in his sweaty hands. He began to speak, his voice oily, praising the legatus. Praising Rome, praising the very boots that trod upon their lands. This was the moment. From various points in the crowd, a strange chorus arose. Not of protest, but of animal noises. The loud, panicked squawking of chickens, the frantic bleating of goats, the indignant winking of pigs. Within seconds, the parade ground was thrown into chaos. Brennus, Donal, and a dozen other young Britons, strategically placed, released a small menagerie of animals. They had smuggled in or liberated from the fort's own livestock pens. Chickens flapped into Roman dignitaries. Pigs darted between the legs of legionaries. Goats began to methodically chew on the decorative banners. Roman discipline, for a moment, wavered. Soldiers, unsure whether to laugh or draw weapons, stumbled after the rampaging animals. The crowd of Britons, initially stunned, began to snicker. Then to openly laugh, the sound a release of long-suppressed tension. In the midst of this carefully orchestrated bedlam, Ira, quick as a flash, darted towards the speaking platform. Vortiper, aghast at the interruption, had momentarily turned his back. Ira reached into a small pouch at her belt and, with a flick of her wrist, sprinkled a fine, almost invisible powder onto Vortiper's unattended cup of wine. It was a mixture Morwenna had prepared. A potent, fast-acting emetic derived from certain fungi, harmless in the long term but spectacularly unpleasant in the short. Vortiper, flustered by the animal chaos, turned back to his speech, took a large gulp of wine to calm his nerves, and resumed his sycophantic praise. Within a minute, a strange green tinge appeared on his face. His eyes widened. He clutched his stomach. And then, to the astonishment of the assembled Romans and the barely concealed delight of the Britons, he was spectacularly, comprehensively sick, right over the edge of the platform and onto the polished boots of a nearby Optio. Crispus's face was a mask of thunderous fury. His festival, his display of Roman control, had descended into a farcical barnyard scene, culminating in the public humiliation of his prize informant. While Roman officers bellowed for order and soldiers chased after pigs, Morwenna, Cater, and their core group used the confusion to melt back into the larger crowd of Britons, who were now finding various excuses to depart the festivities. No arrests had been made, no overt act of rebellion had occurred. But the message was clear. Roman order was not absolute. It could be mocked. It could be disrupted. As they hurried away from the fort, Ira looked at Morwenna, her eyes dancing with a mixture of exhilaration and awe. "They will talk of this for generations," she said. "Perhaps," Morwenna replied, a rare, tired smile touching her lips. "But Crispus will not forget, or forgive." She knew this small victory, this moment of laughter in the face of oppression, would only harden his resolve. The game of cat and mouse had just become far more dangerous. The ashes of Silchester had warned of Roman retribution, and though this was a different kind of defiance, the empire's memory was long, and its reach, vast. The aftermath of the Festival of Disruption, as it came to be known in whispered Britain tales, was swift and predictable. Legatus Crispus, his pride stung and his authority openly mocked, unleashed a wave of punitive measures. Curfews were tightened further. Collective punishments were meted out to villages for the slightest perceived infraction. Patrols were doubled, their moods sullen and aggressive. Several elders who had been present at the festival were summoned to castra exploratorum for questioning, a euphemism for intimidation and thinly veiled threats. None were directly implicated in the animal release or Vortiper's spectacular illness, but the experience left them shaken. Crispus knew Morwenna was the architect of his humiliation. Though he had no concrete proof, her quiet influence, her network that moved like mist through the hills, pointed to her guiding hand. He could not arrest her without risking wider unrest. She was too respected as a healer, too deeply woven into the fabric of her community. So, he chose a different path, isolation. He issued orders forbidding travel between villages without a Roman pass. He declared the ancient Yew Grove, Morwenna's most sacred meeting place, off-limits, stationing a permanent guard post nearby. He aimed to sever the lines of communication. To cut Morwenna off from her network, to slowly starve the resistance of its lifeblood. Morwenna felt the pressure keenly. The ease of movement they had once enjoyed was gone. Ira's young messengers found their paths blocked, their risks multiplied. Cater's reconnaissance became a deadly game of hide and seek. Even obtaining essential herbs for healing grew difficult, as many of the best foraging grounds were now under stricter Roman surveillance. "He is building walls around us," Ira said one evening, her frustration a palpable thing in the small roundhouse. They were mending fishing nets, a task that allowed their hands to be busy while their minds wrestled with their predicament. Not of stone, but of fear and restriction. "And what is our response to walls, child?" Morwenna asked, her fingers deftly working the twine. "We either find a way over, under, or through them. Or we learn to live within them. And make that inner space our own fortress." But living within was becoming increasingly untenable. The news from Aelin the scribe, delivered by a daring young runner who had risked much to reach their now isolated valley, was dire. Crispus, his census data corrupted and his surveying plans in disarray, had requested reinforcements from Eboracum. He was planning to clear the valley of Verida by force, relocating its inhabitants to a less defensible area. To make way for the construction of Castra Firma, the order was to be carried out before the first snows of winter made troop movements difficult. They had, perhaps, a moon cycle. Maybe less. This was no longer about small acts of defiance. This was about survival. The community looked to Morwenna, their fear a heavy cloak. To resist openly was suicide. To comply was to lose their ancestral lands, their homes, their very identity. Cater, his face etched with a terrible resolve, spoke what many were thinking. "We must fight. As we did at Silchester. Better to die on our feet in our own valley than to be herded like sheep to a barren land." Morwenna looked at him, at the faces of her people gathered in the dim light of the communal longhouse. She saw the despair, the anger, but also a flicker of desperate hope. All directed at her. The weight of their expectation was immense. Silchester. The name was a raw wound. So many lost. So much pain. Silchester was a defeat, Cater, she said softly, her voice carrying a profound sadness. A brave defeat, yes. But it broke us for a generation. Is that what we want for our children? Another generation of orphans and broken spirits. Then what, Morwenna? Ira cried out. Do we simply walk away, let them take everything? Morwenna closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. When she opened them, her pale gaze was clear, unwavering. "No," she said. "We do not walk away. And we do not break ourselves upon their shields. We vanish." Her plan was the most audacious yet. They would not fight Crispus as legionaries. They would not be there when they arrived. The entire village of Verida, men, women, children, even their meager livestock, would disappear into the deepest, most hidden recesses of the Pennine Hills, into secret valleys and ancient cave systems that only she and a few trusted elders knew. They would take with them what they could carry: food stores, tools, seeds, and most importantly, their lore, their songs, their identity. It was a desperate gamble. Winter was approaching. The hills were unforgiving. But it was a chance, a way to deny Crispus his victory, to preserve her people, to keep the flame alive, even if it had to burn in the deepest darkness. "Crispus wants to make an example of Verida," Morwenna declared, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "Then let the example be this, that we are the children of this land. We can melt into it like the morning mist. He can build his stone fort in an empty valley. He can rule over ghosts and silence, but he will not rule over us." The exodus from Verida began under the cloak of moonless nights, a silent, sorrowful procession. Every family took what they could carry, their faces etched with anxiety but also a grim determination. Morwenna, Ira, and Kater moved among them, offering encouragement, direction, and a sense of shared purpose. Children were hushed, their small hands clutching precious toys or bundles of herbs. The elderly were supported, their frail bodies testament to the resilience of their people. Livestock, their hooves muffled with rags, were guided along hidden paths. They moved slowly, painstakingly, towards the wild heart of the fells, to a series of interconnected caves and a sheltered, high valley Morwenna had discovered years ago during her solitary wanderings. It was a place of stark beauty, difficult to access, easily defensible by a few, and unknown to the Romans. The final departure from Verida was the hardest. They looked back at their empty roundhouses, at the familiar contours of their valley, now silent and expectant. Morwenna took one last handful of earth from outside her dwelling, her heart aching with a grief too profound for tears. This was not just their home. It was the land of their ancestors, imbued with their spirits, their memories. They left no trace. Hearths were swept clean. Paths were obscured. It was as if the village had simply dissolved into the autumn mist. When Legatus Crispus finally arrived with his cohort, expecting to oversee the forced relocation of a recalcitrant populace, he found an empty valley. Verida was a ghost village. There were no people to relocate, no resistance to crush, no example to be made. Only silence, and a whispering wind that seemed to mock his Roman order. His scouts scoured the surrounding hills for days, but found nothing. The Britons had vanished. Crispus, a man of logic and precision, was infuriated by this intangible defiance. He could fight armies. He could hunt down rebels. But how did one fight an enemy who simply was not there? He ordered the construction of Castra Firma to proceed, but the victory felt hollow, the stone walls rising in a valley that held no triumph for him, only an unsettling emptiness. His census was a collection of lies and absences. His authority, in this wild northern land, felt as insubstantial as the morning mist. Deep within the hidden valley, Morwenna's people established a new, precarious existence. Life was harsh. Food was carefully rationed. The winter winds howled through the caves, but they were together. They were free, in their own way. Morwenna, with Aelin's help he had joined them in their exodus, began the task of meticulously recording the ancient lore. Not on perishable skins, but in the memories of the young, through stories, songs, and rituals conducted in the firelight of their subterranean sanctuary. Ira, matured by their trials, became Morwenna's right hand, her youthful impulsiveness now tempered with a hard-won wisdom. Kader, his old wounds aching in the cold, taught the younger men the arts of survival in the high fells, how to track, to hunt, to move unseen. One evening, as the first snows of winter began to dust the peaks above their hidden valley, Ira found Morwenna gazing out from the mouth of their main cave, towards the distant, unseen valley of Verita where the Romans now labored. "Do you think they will ever find us here?" Ira asked, her voice soft. Morwenna drew her worn cloak tighter. "Perhaps. Rome has long arms. But even if they do, they will find only people. They will not find what truly matters." She looked at Ira, her pale eyes reflecting the faint light of the rising moon. "What matters, child, is the flame we carry within us. The memory of who we are. The songs of our ancestors. The love for this land. As long as we keep that flame alive, they can build 1,000 forts, but they will never truly conquer us." She knew the struggle was far from over. Crispus would not give up. The Roman presence was a shadow that would lie over Britannia for generations to come. But in their hidden valley, under the silent watch of the ancient hills, a small community held fast to its identity, a tiny spark of defiance against the might of an empire. Morwenna, the healer, the keeper of the old ways, had led her people not to a final victory, but to a different kind of survival, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to resist, to remember, and to hope, even in the deepest darkness. The wind still whispered secrets, but now, it also carried the faint, resilient echo of Brythonic songs, rising from the heart of the hidden flame.